Europe, late 1943. 30,000 feet above the gray clouds of Germany, a B-17 flying fortress trembles under enemy fire. The air inside the fuselage is freezing. Breath turns to mist. Hands burn against the metal grips of twin 50 caliber Brownings. Sergeant William Bill Harper, tail gunner of the Lucky Lady, squints through his sight. A formation of Messerschmitt Bf-109s slices through the contrails, their cannon flashes blinking like silent thunder. Harper leads the target, squeezes the trigger, and misses. Again. And again. The sky is alive with red tracer arcs, each one streaking beautifully past the enemy. Harmless. The Germans dive and roll away untouched, vanishing beneath the clouds. The intercom crackles with panic. They're too fast. I'm right on them, and still not hitting. In that chaos, Harper realizes something none of them were taught. The sight isn't lying, but their instincts are. They're aiming where the plane was, not where it will be. Below them, burning wrecks dot the fields of Saxony. Above, the next wave of bombers presses on, unaware that a small revolution in aerial warfare is about to begin. Before 1942, the U.S. Army Air Forces entered World War II with impressive machines but unprepared men behind the guns. The B-17 Flying Fortress, the B-24 Liberator, and the early P-40 Warhawk carried heavy armament, yet their effectiveness depended entirely on the aim of the human gunner. And that aim, as wartime reports later revealed, was tragically flawed. Training in the late 1930s had been little more than marksmanship on a stationary range. Recruits stood on the ground, firing at toed sleeves or paper targets drifting lazily in the sky. The instruction emphasized steadiness and sight alignment, concepts inherited from rifle training, not air combat. No one truly understood how a fighter crossing the bomber's path at 400 miles per hour required a different kind of thinking. The bullet's travel time, the target's speed, and the constantly changing angles. When the air war expanded over Europe, this gap became deadly. Combat analysis from 1942 showed that U.S. bomber gunners fired thousands of rounds for every confirmed kill. In some early raids, a single enemy aircraft destroyed might cost half a bomber crew's entire ammunition load. The Army Air Force's own studies admitted that most rounds fired did not come within 100 feet of the enemy aircraft. The problem wasn't courage, it was perception. Under pressure, gunners aimed directly at the target, trusting their eyes. But by the time the bullet traveled the distance, the enemy had already moved. The result was an illusion. The gunner saw a perfect sight picture, yet missed completely. Compounding the issue was the limited realism of training environments. Recruits practiced on sand ranges in Nevada or Florida, not inside vibrating, freezing bombers. They learned nothing of turret motion, wind turbulence, or the deceptive compression of distance at high altitude. Instructors had few tools beyond lectures and occasional airborne demonstrations. The result was a paradox. The United States possessed the most heavily armed bombers in the world, flying fortresses bristling with guns. Yet these fortresses often failed to protect themselves. Losses mounted over France and the Low Countries. In squadron debriefs, returning gunners described seeing the tracers curve away as if the bullets bent. It wasn't the bullets, it was the math. And by the end of 1942, a handful of officers, scientists, and engineers were beginning to realize that instinct had to be replaced with science, that hitting a moving target required predicting the future. The turning point began quietly, not in combat, but in classrooms and workshops across America. By late 1942, the U.S. Army Air Forces recognized that courage and instinct were not enough. They needed precision. At places like Eglin Field in Florida and Las Vegas Army Gunnery School, teams of engineers and mathematicians began studying film footage from actual combat missions, plotting bullet trajectories frame by frame. What they discovered changed everything. They found that success in air gunnery depended not on reaction, but on prediction. A gunner had to fire not where the enemy was, but where he would be when the bullets arrived. A calculation involving speed, angle, distance, and lead time. This concept, known as deflection shooting, had existed among elite fighter pilots since the First World War, but had never been formally taught to bomber gunners or turret operators. To turn theory into practice, scientists and instructors designed revolutionary tools. The camera gun replaced live fire, capturing footage of where each burst would have gone. The film trainer, an ingenious device projecting moving aircraft onto a screen, allowed gunners to practice tracking targets in motion. Instructors could replay the film, analyze aim points, and explain precisely why a student's rounds would have missed or struck home. Soon, entire schools were devoted to the new science of aerial marksmanship. The Army Air Forces opened 7 major flexible gunnery schools across the United States, from Harlingen, Texas, to Laredo and Kingman, Arizona. Trainees spent weeks learning trigonometry, aircraft identification, and lead estimation before ever touching a real turret. By 1943, the program grew even more advanced. Recruits trained with synthetic trainers, mechanical domes that simulated the vibration, wind, and noise of combat. Some were linked to motion picture projectors and computer-calculated target paths. The result was a new kind of soldier, not a reflexive shooter, but a disciplined technician capable of translating movement into mathematics within seconds. The initiative attracted scientific minds from across the nation. Physicists and engineers from MIT and Caltech contributed to developing computing gunsights that could automatically adjust for speed and angle, precursors to modern targeting computers. By the time these new gunners graduated, the difference was visible. Reports from training bases showed a doubling, sometimes tripling, of simulated hit accuracy. And when the first of them arrived in England, carrying this new doctrine of deflection, their commanders noticed something else: confidence. The bomber crews no longer felt helpless. They had a method, a way to fight back that worked. And soon, over the gray skies of occupied Europe, the numbers would prove it. The human angle, for the gunners who climbed aboard those bombers, the sky was not a stage for glory. It was survival. Most were young, barely 20 years old, and had never fired a weapon in anger. Inside the trembling body of a B-17, each turret was its own world, a sealed bubble of noise, vibration, and fear. Early in the war, many described the same haunting feeling: the helplessness of watching enemy fighters attack from every direction, confident in their own accuracy, while the Americans wasted ammunition in panic. Gunners were expected to remain calm as tracers lit up the sky. Yet many admitted afterward that they fired wherever the enemy looked biggest. It was instinct, not training. When the new deflection techniques reached the front lines, that instinct had to be unlearned. Instructors demanded discipline: measure, track, predict, then fire. At first it felt unnatural, almost wrong, to aim behind a moving target. But when the first gunners began hitting consistently, the disbelief turned to quiet confidence. They had learned to trust math over emotion, precision over panic. For many, that shift was more psychological than mechanical. They began to see the air not as chaos, but as geometry, angles and timing governed by invisible laws. And in that understanding, they found power. The technological angle, while men were learning to think differently, machines were being built to help them do it. The heart of this revolution was the Sperry power turret, a marvel of American engineering. It gave gunners near total control through electric motors that could rotate 360 degrees, responding instantly to movement. In the tight confines of a bomber, the Sperry turret transformed human reaction into mechanical precision. But the true leap forward came with the gunsights. Early sights were static rings, simple, fixed patterns that forced gunners to guess the enemy's future position. Then came the computing gunsight, a compact mechanical brain that factored in target speed and turn rate. The best of them all, introduced in 1944, was the K-14 gyroscopic sight. Inside its glass dome, spinning gyros sensed the gun's movement and calculated lead automatically. The gunner needed only to track smoothly. The sight did the math. These innovations blurred the line between man and machine. The gunner became part of a system. Human intuition fused with gyroscopic precision. And for the first time, the U.S. aircrews could meet the Luftwaffe on equal terms in the deadly mathematics of the sky. The enemy angle to the German fighter pilots of the Luftwaffe, American bombers were both formidable and predictable. By 1943, formations of B-17s and B-24s filled the skies over Europe, their defensive guns bristling in every direction. Yet, despite this forest of firepower, Luftwaffe aces like Egon Meyer, Georg Peter Eder, and Walter Dahl discovered a deadly pattern. The Americans' bullets almost never met their mark. The Germans studied their enemy with clinical precision. Attacks from the rear, once considered suicidal, became standard because U.S. gunners almost always aimed directly at the attacking aircraft. The Luftwaffe learned to dive in fast, fire, and roll away before the bombers could adjust. Meyer even developed the famous head-on attack tactic, counting on the Americans' inability to compute the correct deflection in a split second. Combat films from downed bombers confirmed it. Most defensive fire passed harmlessly behind the German fighters. To the Luftwaffe, it was proof that courage without calculation meant nothing. And for every American loss, the message grew clearer. Technology alone would not save them. The German advantage was not superior machines, but superior understanding of motion. It was this realization, painful and undeniable, that forced the U.S. Army Air Forces to change how their men thought, not just how they fired. The leadership angle change rarely begins with orders. It begins with people who refuse to accept failure. Among those was Lieutenant Kohler's John H. DeRussy, a quiet but relentless officer stationed at Eglin Field. After reviewing gun camera footage, he saw what most others missed. Perfect aim, perfect sights, but every shot trailing just behind. DeRussy gathered engineers, physicists, and pilots to dissect the problem. Together, they built experimental ranges, film simulators, and moving target trainers that mimicked real combat geometry. His philosophy was simple: train as you fight, and fight as you train. Instructors at Las Vegas, Harlingen, and Tyndall Fields carried his approach forward. They created competitive exercises, scoring each trainee's lead and deflection accuracy. Failure wasn't punished, it was studied. Every miss became data. Every error, a lesson. The leadership's focus shifted from punishing mistakes to understanding why they happened. It was a quiet revolution in military education, a rare blend of science, psychology, and patience. By mid-1943, the results spoke for themselves. Crews returning from missions reported not just more kills, but fewer wasted rounds. In after-action briefings, commanders noticed something new in their gunners' voices. Calm, controlled confidence. They no longer guessed, they calculated. The lessons of Eglin and the flexible gunnery schools had finally taken flight. And soon, that knowledge would be tested in the fiercest skies of the war. October 14, 1943, the date every bomber crew in Europe would remember. Morning over England was cold and clear as hundreds of B-17 flying fortresses lifted from their runways, forming a steel armada that stretched for miles. Their target, the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt, deep inside Germany. The mission was simple on paper, catastrophic in execution. It would become known as Black Thursday. As the bombers crossed the Rhine, German radar screens lit up. Squadrons of Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs scrambled to intercept. Within minutes, the blue sky turned into a battlefield. The Luftwaffe attacked from head-on, diving through the formations at over 400 miles per hour. But this time, something was different. Inside the lead elements of the 91st and 305th Bomb Groups, newly trained gunners put their lessons to the test. Instead of panicking or firing directly at the enemy, they measured movement, tracked smoothly, and aimed slightly behind or ahead based on angle and distance. They fired where the fighters would be, not where they were. Gun cameras later confirmed it. The difference was staggering. Where previous missions had recorded long arcs of wasted tracer fire, Schweinfurt showed short, controlled bursts intersecting cleanly with enemy flight paths. Luftwaffe pilots, who once danced effortlessly through defensive fire, now found themselves flying into invisible walls of bullets. In the official post-mission analysis, U.S. intelligence noted that kill ratios had doubled compared to earlier raids. Gunners reported confirmed hits with far fewer rounds fired. One squadron logged an average of 1 German aircraft destroyed for every 1,200 rounds, half the previous expenditure. The cost of the mission was still immense. 60 bombers lost, 600 men missing. But those who returned brought back something priceless. Proof that deflection worked. Crew debriefs described the same realization. It felt strange to aim off the mark, but when the tracers crossed his flight line, the fighter exploded. For the first time, science had beaten instinct in the air. The United States had begun to close the deadly gap that had haunted its bomber crews for 2 long years. That lesson would not remain confined to Europe. Across the vast Pacific, another generation of American gunners and pilots would soon learn the same truth, that survival depended on the courage to aim where the enemy wasn't yet. Thousands of miles from Europe's gray skies, the Pacific War was testing American gunners in a different crucible. Sunlit, brutal, and fast. Here, there were no bomber streams stretching across the horizon, no protective formations. Battles unfolded over endless ocean, where survival came down to seconds and instinct. By 1943, U.S. Navy carrier groups were under constant assault from Japanese dive bombers and torpedo planes. Early on, sailors struggled with the same fatal flaw the bomber gunners had faced. They fired at the target, not ahead of it. Tracers stitched the air beautifully, but the enemy aircraft sliced through the gaps unharmed. That changed with the introduction of lead computing gun directors and deflection training adopted from the Army Air Forces research. Naval instructors began teaching the concept of lag, pursuit, trailing slightly behind a turning target to predict its arc, and lead, pursuit, firing ahead of a straight line, attack. The effect was immediate. At battles like Philippine Sea, 1944, the so-called Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, radar-guided fire control and well-trained gunners turned entire waves of Japanese aircraft into flaming wrecks before they reached the carriers. Navy reports recorded hit probabilities nearly doubling compared to 1942 engagements. What had once been chaotic, instinctive fire became coordinated, mathematical defense. In the air, fighter pilots embraced the same principles. The F-6F Hellcat and F-4U Corsair dominated dogfights not only because of their power, but because American pilots had mastered energy management and deflection. The once mystical concept of leading the target became second nature. Gunnery films from Pacific airfields showed pilots practicing against drones and moving silhouettes, firing where the enemy would be when the bullets arrived. Japanese pilots, trained on rigid point-and-shoot techniques, found themselves outclassed. They often overshot or undershot in tight turns, while U.S. pilots calmly timed their bursts, turning geometry into victory. By 1945, the principle of deflection had spread through every branch of American forces, from bomber turrets to destroyer decks. It unified airmen, sailors, and ground gunners under one shared truth. Success depended not on reflex, but on understanding motion. In Europe, it had saved bombers. In the Pacific, it would help win the skies and the sea. As the war neared its end, commanders began to see deflection not just as a tactic, but as a mindset, one that symbolized the evolution of modern warfare itself. By late 1944, the transformation was undeniable. What began as a desperate correction in training had become one of the most measurable successes in the history of air warfare. The United States Army Air Force's own records showed that average rounds per enemy aircraft destroyed had fallen by nearly half since 1942, where once it took over 2,050 caliber rounds to down a single fighter. By 1944, it required closer to $900 at gunnery schools across the United States. The results were even clearer. Final evaluation tests, where trainees used camera guns to film simulated dogfights, showed accuracy improvements exceeding 100% compared to early war recruits. Graduates of the new flexible gunnery school program were not just faster. They were methodical, deliberate, and far more confident in their predictive aim. In the European theater, the data echoed the same success. After the Schweinfurt missions, the 8th Air Force reported that bomber formations with trained deflection gunners achieved double the kill ratios of untrained units. Entire squadrons credited their survival to new aiming principles. Post-raid analyses showed that gunners who used controlled bursts and predictive tracking conserved ammunition while scoring more kills. This wasn't merely a tactical improvement. It was logistical as well. Each .50 caliber round weighed roughly 2 ounces. Cutting ammunition use by half across hundreds of bombers saved fuel, weight, and time, allowing greater range and payloads. In an air campaign where every gallon of fuel mattered, accuracy was strategy. The U.S. Navy, too, reaped the rewards. After implementing deflection and fire control training in 1943-44, shipboard gunnery accuracy rose sharply. Reports from the Pacific Fleet noted that coordinated radar and lead computing directors reduced hit latency by as much as 40%. Ships could now repel mass air attacks without depleting their magazines. By war's end, both the Army and Navy were already studying how to preserve these gains for the future. In 1946, the U.S. Air Force established permanent gunnery research units, combining ballistics experts and psychologists to analyze wartime data. Their conclusion was clear. The shift from instinct to computation marked the beginning of modern fire control doctrine, the ancestor of every radar and computer-guided weapon to come. The war had proven a simple truth. Knowledge was ammunition. Technical charts and kill ratios told one story, but the men behind the guns told another. For thousands of airmen who had once fired blindly into the sky, the new gunnery doctrine was more than a skill. It was a lifeline. Post-mission interviews recorded at bases in England and Italy reveal a common sentiment among crews: control. Before the training, it felt like luck, recalled Staff Sergeant William D. Price, a top turret gunner with the 390th Bomb Group. You'd see tracers flying past the Germans and think maybe one would hit. After deflection training, it felt like you were in charge of the fight. That psychological shift was profound. For the first time, American gunners felt that the battlefield wasn't chaos, it was geometry. The Germans were no longer untouchable blurs in the sky. They were predictable, beatable. The same men who once braced for every attack now spoke with analytical calm about lead angles and computed burst lengths. Combat reports reflected this newfound composure. Observers noted fewer wasted bursts, more coordinated fire, and a marked drop in panic shooting. Crews described how even under fire, the training took over, hands adjusting elevation, mind predicting the enemy's path. It was like hearing your instructor's voice in the back of your head, said one ball turret gunner, telling you to wait, Now, these small psychological victories added up. By late 1944, morale among gunnery crews had improved so dramatically that mission readiness rates climbed across multiple air forces. Commanders began referring to the gunners as the thinking fighters, men who combined reflex with reason. For many, that sense of mastery outlasted the war. In interviews conducted years later by the Air Force Historical Division, veterans spoke of the moment when fear turned into focus. One recalled, "When we learned how to shoot right, the fear didn't go away. It just had somewhere to go." That transformation, from frightened reaction to disciplined precision, became one of the lasting legacies of World War II aerial combat. It wasn't just about surviving, it was about understanding the fight. By the time peace returned, the men who once fought through confusion had become teachers, instructors, and engineers. Their experience shaped every post-war training manual, every targeting computer, and every generation that followed. For them, victory wasn't only measured in aircraft destroyed, but in the quiet confidence that came from knowing they could finally fight back and win. War has always demanded courage, but in the skies of World War II, courage alone was not enough. Victory came to those who learned to think ahead, to see the invisible pattern behind chaos. The discovery of deflection, aiming not where the enemy is, but where they will be, became more than a gunnery technique. It was a metaphor for a new kind of warfare, one where intellect guided instinct. In the frozen skies over Europe and the blazing horizons of the Pacific, thousands of young men learned to predict rather than react, to understand rather than fear. Every pull of the trigger carried not just bullets, but calculation, an understanding of time, motion, and consequence. This shift in perspective reflected a deeper transformation in human conflict. Modern warfare was no longer a test of bravery alone, but of perception, of learning to think in moments where thought seemed impossible. Long after the last B-17s landed and the smoke cleared from the Pacific, that lesson endured. The ability to see beyond the present moment, to lead, anticipate, and adapt, would define not only air combat, but the future of every battlefield to come. The gunners of World War II did more than survive the air war. They changed the way humanity understood it, proving that the mind, as much as the machine, could shape the outcome of war.